Okay, I hope you see everyone's presentation. So, so I'm going to focus very quickly on one specific sub-project, so the NUMAPress project. So the NUMAPress project is a project in digital humanities about newspapers in French, and more broadly about redefining cultural history of French-speaking newspaper with massive text and images classification. So here today, I'm going to focus especially on one particular case, which is a movie section in the interwar period, because it's one of the most important interplay between the newspaper text and images. So I'm going to go very quickly there, but our core idea is that since we're working with newspaper, we have to develop a kind of more contextual approach of text mining, because they are not going to be simply a continuous string of text, but complex spatial structure mixing text and imaging and other layout objects. So concretely, we have done all the work as a NUMAPress project by retrieving detailed digitization documents in alpha formats, which includes block coordinates, so serial rates and stuff like that, mostly from the French National Library, although now we diversify a bit. So we are going mostly to be working on from daily newspapers digitized by the French National Libraries from the 19th century to 1940s, which is roughly the end period for public domain. So just a quick point about non-images classification is going to be important for this. It's about locating movie pages. So just to have an idea of what we're working on. So this is the kind of movie pages that were appearing with the French newspaper at the time. So it's very, very advanced construct actually. It's kind of a feeling of avant-garde comparing to other newspaper pages at the same period, because there is a very, very strong interplay between images and text and so on. So it's almost magazine-like. And so, yeah, we have to look at this kind of pages. So they were only running for one page, which is kind of practical because we know that all the pages is talking about movies. So we simply have to retrieve this one pages, and now we know it are talking about movie news. So what we have developed, obviously, first we developed a model to retrieve text and identify text using JAWS. So it's a big, larger project for NUMAPress, which is to develop models for every 20 years periods of the newspaper. So we develop models with about 20 different JAWS, and we apply them on the entire corpus. And so it's a simple bag of words model, but what's interesting is that once you do that, you can project it graphically, so you can see actually how it's looking like on the movie pages. So we see that actually most of the text blocks are going to be identified as a green color, which is for movies, but some may not be. But when we are mostly working with probabilities here. So for instance, we may identify all the blocks with more than 20% movie section. And so in the end, we are going to retrieve them. What's even more interesting is that once you do that, you can have the trends, and usually the movie sections are going to appear as spikes. So you see here, it's a weekly, it's an entire month for the newspaper, and you see the growth of movie sections each day, and you see huge spikes, which is about the time when you're going to have the movie pages. So through that, we were able to retrieve them and develop a small project called La Page de Cinéma, so the page of the movies, which contain all the movies. So now I'm moving to the core elements of the presentation about image poetics of the movie section. So once we have done the identification of the pages, we are able to retrieve all the images, because once again, we have the detailed digitization archive. So we have the coordinates of each images, and we're able to retrieve them using the TOPL-IF endpoint of the French National Library. So we have a large corpus of about 26,000 images from the movie sections. And our first trial was simply applying existing models, but we quickly ran into the issue with anachronism, because they were not built for this. And for instance, we had a lot of issue with clothes, which were mistaken for military uniform because they were highly covering. So instead, we developed our own models using a random sample of 2,000 images from the corpus, and we developed our own typology and ontology, and using actually what were the main stereotypes and patterns for images at the time. And so, for instance, you have an example, but you can also go to the website to check to retrieve this kind of images. So, for instance, it's a portrait shaped like a medallion. So you see everyone is oval, so it's fairly easy to retrieve them. You have also all the portraits which are stereotypically a couple, so Hollywood-like couple from the time. Even funnier, you can have example of there was a lot of movie stills which are actually dining scenes, so people were thinking a lot about eating at the time apparently, and you can retrieve these kind of things. And even more interesting is not simply to have an idea of how these patterns, we can compare them and stuff like that, but mostly to have an idea of trends. And here you can have some very interesting insights for cultural history. So one of my favorite examples is with the portrait shaped like a medallion, and we see it disappear throughout the corpus, and simply because at some point it became kind of vintage. So apparently it was not up to date anymore. So we have the ability to run them, and we have also the ability, it's not being displayed here, but to reapply the same model on later weeklies, and it has completely disappeared. So definitely it's a kind of thing that we can have a gut feeling something is appearing if you simply read for the corpus, but you need to have really the classification to see the global trends. Another thing which we are really interested in is in image duplications, because at the time there was a lot of reprints. And once you use the vectors from the classification, you can reuse them to identify reprints. So we have done that a bit. And we have seen, for instance, how there are kind of recycling movie stills into different kind of articles. It can be recycles, for instance, for interview and stuff like that. So now we have kind of a bigger project on viral images from the 19th century and 20th century. So just as a conclusion, so it was just a specific project, which was interesting simply for the interplay between images, text, and so on, and the fact that you really need to have the complete detailed newspaper pages, digital documents to be able to run this kind of things. And more broadly, it has made us think about what we can reuse from this kind of analysis. So now one of the big projects we're currently leading up, which is completely different, is called Generotech. So it's an idea of building a library of models which will make them reusable with the full training corpora and stuff like that. So it was first built with the text in mind, but we're also going to do that for images, for the newspaper and stuff like that. So the idea is that they can be reused. And it's, for the time being, that's only in French. And I think that's all. Thanks for watching.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Carl. Are there any quick clarifying questions?
Yes, did you choose the coding class? Oh yes, it was very easy to exercise. No, motivated because topics to be researched actually. But what we did actually, it was a kind of interesting experiment about the selection of the labels of the images that we simply had to browse at some point a random sample of corpus, and we have to find kind of recurring patterns and stuff like that. So it's like even interesting simply from a qualitative perspective, because you have to really see the thing through in a kind of structural way in the way the patterns was appearing, which was kind of different than if you have looked them in the newspaper. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag, definitely. But most of the time it was having an interest in topics and like that. For instance, medallion portrait was a thing that was already interesting to me. And yeah, I'm going to make the slides available in the comments.
I wonder if each of you could comment on training your own model versus using existing models. Pierre-Carl, I think you mentioned that you had done training with 2,000 images against a full image base that was in the tens of thousands.
So in my case, actually, I worked a bit similarly. Firstly, as some of the presentations that Peter showed, because first we tried to simply reuse the patterns, visual patterns drawn by the neural networks. Like we are kind of clusters, which were actually better than using the direct labels, because the labels were simply not out of touch with what we were seeing in the images. So it was something doable. But afterwards, at some point, actually what changed a lot for us is simply the fact that we have the access to a GPU. So we had the material ability to retrain the models. And definitely it doesn't take that many time, as we say it actually, when you start to have a corpus. So 25,000 wasn't that much actually. By now we are getting more into the hundreds and stuff like that. So definitely it's going to pay off the most as you're going to extend a bit. And yes, it doesn't take actually that many time. And it's actually interesting for someone working on the history of visual patterns, basically, because when you're going to see and browse through all the random images which you're going to see, you're going to make connections which are going to be hard to be making when you're going to always see the images in its context. But here it's decontextualized. So you really see all the spread and the patterns, the thing recurring. So it's really kind of interesting. I think there is even perhaps some kind of new forms to invent about like a notebook of training or something like that, when you have ideas that are going to pop up when you're going to do the actual training.
To what degree are there image models or techniques that the three of you think we might be sharing as a community with each other? assuming that there are any that are LAMP specific.
We have used also segmentation models for the corpus where we didn't have the treatment and the processing done by the French National Library. So they already identified the images in their own corpus, but we have digitized some of the corpus ourselves. We didn't have this ability. So we trained a mask once again on images and ads from Weekly, and we are able to extract them. So definitely it's going to be useful. Another thing that Weekly mentioned at the end is when you're going to break up the networks, you really can get some interesting thing, because the way the layers are assembled, they can get you on the information. So for instance, we discovered that actually the best way to identify images reprints were not to take the last vectors, but to take actually something like the middle one, because it is sufficiently not too precise, but sufficiently generalized, so you can get a middle one. So now it's the kind of thing we are going to do in a shortcut. We are on a much larger corpus to identify all the images being reprinted, especially in the 19th century where there wasn't any copyright at the time for images. So there was a lot of reprints. This is definitely some of the things we can reuse from the models.